Melisandre stood on the wind-swept battlements of the wall, her red robes snapping in the cold wind that groaned through every crack in the ancient ice. Night was falling, and the sky was a deep violet bruised by the last streaks of sun. She gazed beyond the wall, where an endless expanse of white reached north toward mysterious forests and darkened valleys. She knew the terrors that lurked in the cold, the monstrous threat that waited in the polar dark, but her faith in the Lord of Light was no longer the unwavering torch it had once been. She held no brazier in her hands tonight. No sacred fire glowed to illuminate her pale face. All she had were her own doubts. She had found herself questioning too much. R'hllor, the Red God, had called her across the sea. She had left behind a life of servitude, and over the many years she had been a champion of his will, exercising magic and prophecy, guiding kings and warriors toward what she believed to be a predestined path. But illusions shattered as easily as glass. After Stannis Baratheon's defeat, after watching the aftermath of what she had believed to be a grand, destined victory, Melisandre began to suspect that perhaps she had misunderstood everything. So many mistakes weighed on her, from the innocent blood spilled on a false promise to the countless nights of searching her fires for guidance, only to see visions that never came to pass. She thought of Davos Seaworth's face, etched in pain, horror, and fury at the loss of Shireen. She thought of Stannis's unwavering gaze, the rime of desperation in his eyes as he marched into a blizzard, believing her predictions. It had all felt so certain at the time. Now, she suspected she had never truly known the Lord of Light's will. Perhaps she had only known her own fanatic longing for meaning in a world that reeked of death and cruelty. Now, she was not so sure any god truly guided her. Winter's chill had settled into her bones, unnatural for one who had long relied upon a secret warmth. She had used her ruby choker to sustain an image of youth, drawing on the power that threaded her veins. But each day that passed, she perceived the temperature more keenly. She felt the bite of the wind, the sting of the frost, and the creeping dread of mortality. The illusions she had conjured for herself and for others faded. She remained beautiful but felt the cracks forming in her certainties like lines of ice splintering across a frozen lake. Night loomed darker, no longer comforted by the flickering flame of R'hllor. As she gazed out over the edge of the wall, she wondered if she had been a useful pawn to a power beyond her comprehension. Now that power seemed silent. Nights at Castle Black were restless. She had no peace in her meditations. The flames flickered, but they spoke in whispers she could not decipher, or perhaps no longer wished to. She had glimpsed figures in them, unknown silhouettes, but her mind had begun to resist analyzing them. Fear of discovering another misguided prophecy, fear of how many more innocents might suffer from her interpretations, crippled her. She asked herself if the Lord of Light was truly a god of justice or simply a hungry flame that devoured all it touched. A fresh gust carried swirling snow along the top of the wall, needling at her exposed cheeks. She shut her eyes against the cold and turned away from the emptiness beyond the edge. She descended the steps, her red slippers treading carefully, the torch brackets near the top leaving elongated shadows behind her. At the base of the stairs, she found Ghost, the direwolf, staring at her with those haunting red eyes. The great white wolf said nothing, but she could sense some sort of wariness, perhaps a reflection of her own. The Night's Watchmen who passed her said little to the Red Woman anymore. They treated her with a kind of distant courtesy, but she could sense the undercurrent of mistrust. She could hardly blame them. Jon Snow was gone, slain by mutineers and then brought back to life by Melisandre's magic. She had asked R'hllor to answer her desperate plea, and for whatever reason, that prayer had been answered. But once the breath of life returned to Jon, the sense of the divine receded from her. He too had left her behind. She had followed him south for a time, cast out only when Davos brought her darkest deed to the open. She could still hear his stern voice demanding she ride south and never return. They spared her life, an outcome she never would have allowed if their positions had been reversed. She had once believed in harsh, even cruel justice to fulfill prophecy. Now she felt something akin to gratitude for the mercy she had received. She wondered if that was a small sign that the path of unwavering severity was not the only way. North was where she felt pulled, even if she couldn't explain why. She expected no welcome there, for the dangers that lurked beyond the wall recognized no living soul as friend. But some invisible thread in her heart tugged her, urging her deeper into the frosty gloom. Doubt needled at her every step. She questioned if it was a last vestige of her old connection to the Red God or something else entirely. The quiet nights, the glimpses in the dying embers, the sense that she was being watched from behind the dense lines of pine and weirwood, none of it felt like Lawler. Slowly, she realized that she was hearing the forest itself, the primal heartbeat that she had always disregarded as belonging to false gods. Each night, she found it harder to pray to Lawler. Instead, she wrapped herself in a thick cloak and stared across the silent expanse of the snowdrifts. She listened for something she could not name. She did not know if it was the murmur of the old gods or some other presence, but she felt something beyond the measure of men's knowledge, older than human worship, older even than the first men. At times, she felt the weight of eyes on her as she slept. She would awaken in a cold sweat, the embers of the hearth reduced to a single glow. And in that glow, once or twice, she thought she saw a pair of small, golden-green eyes staring at her from the darkness of the room, only to vanish when she blinked. Eventually, her fear of the unknown gave way to curiosity. She was no stranger to the arcane. She had delved into the deeper mysteries of the Lord of Light's faith, into the illusions and glamours that bound men's eyes. Yet, the presence that now lingered beyond her door was neither menacing nor full of false promise. It felt patient, like old roots that had grown deep and abiding. She made her decision on a cold, moonlit night. The wind had stilled, and the sky was dusted with pale stars. She left Castle Black behind, taking only her staff, a few provisions, and the red cloak that had become her armor. Her ruby choker glowed faintly against her collarbone, but she wondered if its power might fail her in the presence of this northern magic she could neither name nor define. She did not expect a friendly reception. If whites or white walkers found her first, so be it. She no longer wished to hide behind illusions. She had to know what called to her, and if it was doom, she would greet it with open eyes. At the edge of the haunted forest, the snow crunched beneath her slippers. The air was utterly still, thick with the hush of winter night. Each tree loomed like a sentinel, and the gnarled branches above interlocked to blot out most of the moonlight. With her keen senses, she tried to detect any heat that might betray an approaching threat. But here, in the gloom of these ancient woods, nothing was simple. The darkness was alive with secrets. She could not shake the feeling of being observed from every direction. Yet her fear was mild, overshadowed by something akin to acceptance. She knew she came here willingly. She wandered for hours, sometimes stumbling over hidden roots or skidding on frozen streams. Her breath plumed in the chilled air. The flicker of her staff's small flame illuminated only a short arc around her. From time to time, she paused to look for signs of life. Footprints, broken twigs, anything. At dawn, she found herself in a small clearing. Its center was marked by a weirwood tree whose twisted face seemed to watch her with those carved eyes. Red sap wept from the carved gash that served as a mouth, and the bark glowed eerily in the early light. She sensed more strongly than ever before that she was being observed not by men, but by the deep magic of the old gods, perhaps the same magic that had called her forth. She approached the tree, feeling some innate reverence, though she had never paid homage to anything but the Lord of Light. Yet, something in her chest stirred. She saw no illusions in the trunk, no false visions, just the ancient face, unchanging and eternal. With trembling fingers, she touched the bark. For a moment, she felt only the texture of the wood, rough and cold, but then she felt more. A humming resonance fluttered in her veins, as if the very trees had a heartbeat. She shut her eyes and sensed the presence of countless memories, a tapestry of centuries woven by silent watchers. She felt the echoes of ancient battles, the arrival of the first men, the forging of the night's watch. She felt the sorrow of the forest, the slow retreat of those who once held stewardship over the land. A whisper, soft as leaves rustling in a breeze, brushed against her mind. She did not recognize the tongue at first, but it carried the weight of longing and caution. She opened her eyes, and the clearing was empty save for the weirwood. Yet, she knew she was no longer alone. She could feel a presence near, flitting between the trunks, cloaked by illusions far older than hers. She waited, keeping her hand on the tree, ignoring the cold seeping through her robe. When they revealed themselves, it was without ceremony. One moment the clearing was empty, and the next moment, 3 small figures stood among the roots of the weirwood. Children of the forest, she realized, though she had only heard rumors and tales. Their large, luminous eyes regarded her. They were slight, smaller than human children, but radiating a quiet power. Leaves and bits of bark clung to their bodies in strange patterns, and their skin seemed almost dappled to blend with the wood. One of them carried a small staff crowned with a crystal that shimmered faintly, reminiscent of the glow in her own ruby choker. Melisandre expected them to vanish the moment she turned her gaze upon them, but they held their ground, assessing her just as she assessed them. She felt no immediate threat. Instead, she sensed a cautious invitation in their silence. She spoke first, her voice rasping in the cold air. "I know you watch. I have felt your eyes for some time." They exchanged glances. One of them spoke, and her voice sounded like the hush of wind through leaves. She did not speak the common tongue fluidly, but Melisandre understood enough. "You are different from the fire people now. You do not burn with the same light." Melisandre nodded slowly. "My fire has faded. Perhaps I have chosen to let it." She looked at them, unsure how much they understood. "I have come to you because I believe I have been lied to, or perhaps I have lied to myself. If you are guardians of the true magic, perhaps you can show me what is real." They did not speak for a long moment. Then one stepped closer. Its eyes flickered across the ruby choker, and Melisandre felt a faint tug, as though the child tested the edges of its glamour. A wave of dizziness passed over her, and she saw her own reflection in those dark, mirrored eyes. The lines of age hidden beneath the glamour threatened to surface, but she willed herself to remain as she was, fragile illusions and all. If this was to be her path, she would accept it. With a small gesture, the child beckoned her to follow. She did, stepping over twisted roots, pressing deeper into the forest. They walked for hours, even as the sun climbed higher and then slanted toward the western horizon. Melisandre's breath came in shallow gasps, for she was unaccustomed to trudging so far in the cold without the blessings of the Red God to shield her. Her staff's flame was extinguished. She no longer wished to rely on that light. It felt almost sacrilegious to bring the flame of R'hllor into these ancient depths. They halted when they reached a secluded hollow, sheltered from the wind by a dense ring of trees. A hidden entrance yawned at the base of a rocky outcrop, leading into darkness below. The child who led her turned, its eyes reflecting the dying daylight, and gestured for her to enter. Melisandre hesitated, feeling a tug of apprehension in her gut. She recalled the dark crypts beneath Dragonstone, the hidden passages in Ass High, the labyrinthine gloom of Storm's End. Darkness rarely intimidated her, for her faith had always been in the light, but she no longer knew if the light was hers. Nonetheless, she steeled herself and followed them into the damp, subterranean passage. The smell of earth and decay surrounded her as she descended. Roots dangled from the low ceiling, and water dripped into small pools. The children glided ahead, their footsteps almost silent on the stone floor. Melisandre held her staff high, but she did not conjure a flame. Instead, she let her eyes adjust to the faint luminescence emanating from small crystals embedded in the walls. She realized with fascination that the crystals pulsed in time with her heartbeat, or perhaps it was in time with some deeper rhythm in the earth. At length, they emerged into a large chamber. Stalactites dripped from the ceiling, and a pale green glow bathed everything in an otherworldly light. In the center of the chamber stood an ancient weirwood throne, grown in twisted loops, its base sinking into the ground as if it had been there for centuries. A figure sat upon it, another child of the forest, older than any of the three who had led her. The lines of age in its face were subtle, but the long moss-like hair that draped over its shoulders and the deep grooves around its large eyes bespoke many decades, perhaps centuries. It regarded Melisandre with a gaze that felt as though it passed through her entire being. The three who had brought her spoke in hushed tones, a language full of clicks and rustling syllables. Melisandre caught only fragments. The elder child tilted its head. Then, in a voice that was like cracking ice, it addressed her in the common tongue. "Why do you come here, fire woman? Your kind has long destroyed our groves, cut our trees, spilled our blood. You serve a god who hunts in flame and shadow." Melisandre's throat felt tight, but she answered with as much honesty as she could. "I have turned from that path, or I am trying to. I was misled. Perhaps I misled myself. I do not know. I only know that my illusions have caused much suffering, and the light I believed in may be little more than my own reflection." The elder child watched her, unblinking. "And you think to find a new reflection here, among the roots and songs of the earth?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I have felt a call or a pull to come here. Maybe it is destiny, maybe it is chance. If you want me gone, I will leave. But I sense you know things about this world that I have never understood." She hesitated. "You might know how to save it." A flicker of sorrow passed behind the child's eyes. "Long have we tried to save this land from the evils that dwell in the cold night. We have warred with the first men, and then we taught them. We have guarded against the others for ages, forging alliances with men when we must, and retreating when men turn on us. Always the pattern repeats, and we watch from the shadows. Our songs are older than your kings and your priests, even older than your red god, who is but a flame in the cosmic dark." Melisandre nodded, a wave of humility sweeping over her. She had once seen R'hllor as the ultimate truth. Now, in the face of an ancient being that could possibly recall events from the dawn of time, her once vaunted knowledge felt like a candle in a raging storm. "Teach me," she said. "Help me to undo the harm I have done. If it means casting aside my illusions, I am willing." The elder child rose from the throne in a fluid motion. Tiny flecks of iridescence danced in the air around it. "Your illusions are not merely garments you can discard. They are part of who you have become. But perhaps you can learn. Perhaps we can show you a different path." And so began Melisandre's slow initiation into the mysteries of the children of the forest. She stayed in that subterranean realm for many days, though it was difficult to keep track of time beneath the earth. The children showed her secret caverns where underground streams flowed, their waters pure and cold. They led her to hidden places where ancient runes were etched into the stone, telling stories of the world's creation and the birth of the others. She saw images of great battles in ages past, silhouettes of long-dead heroes that had once helped stave off the long night. She learned to quiet her mind and listen, truly listen, to the silent rhythms of the natural world. The children sat in circles around her, guiding her with gentle, whispering voices. She felt the slow heartbeat of the trees, the deep pulse of the living earth. It was strange to her, having always relied on the bright spark of flame as her source of power. Here, the magic was more patient, rooted in memory, shaped by growth and decay in equal measure. She found that her bright illusions, her glamours, flickered uncertainly in the presence of this older magic. More than once, she found her face lined with the truth of her years. But the children did not recoil from her age or her withered form. They watched her without judgment. In time, Melisandre realized she could let go of her choker if she wished. The child who had tested her illusions softly indicated that she need not cling to that source of power in this place. But a part of Melisandre still held onto it, for she was not ready to see the full truth of her own reflection. She was uncertain if she could relinquish such a core part of herself without losing all sense of identity. The children did not force the matter. They knew that transformation takes time. She learned their ways piece by piece. They showed her how to read the lines of weirwood bark, how to interpret the flows of energies around old heart trees. She saw that the network of roots and trees formed a vast tapestry of awareness, What men called the gods wood was but a fragment of this ancient web. She felt a stirring in her soul when she placed her hand upon a living weirwood and sensed the pulses of consciousness that extended far beyond the forest near the wall. The entire land of Westeros felt alive. Every grove connected, every cluster of weirwoods acting as a node in an immense, invisible realm. One night, if it was truly night above, she sat by the underground stream, listening to the gentle flow of water. The elder child approached her, soft footsteps echoing in the chamber. Without preamble, it spoke. "You are troubled." Melisandre bowed her head. "I have caused so much death in the name of my God. Now I see that the world is more vast and complicated than I ever imagined. I fear I have no place in it." The child's voice was quiet. "Your guilt weighs on you, but guilt alone will not shape the future. We all stand at the brink of another long night. The White Walkers, the others, stir in the far north, and we have done what we can. Yet men squabble over crowns and gold. Your kind has turned from the real threat." She thought of the Night King, or whatever name men gave the chief among the others, and the dead who marched in the swirling snow. "They are a terror beyond measure," she whispered. "I have seen them in the flames. I believed the Lord of Light would be our champion against them. But now," she shook her head, "I no longer know if his champion is any more benevolent than they are." The child tilted its head. "Flame destroys, but it also warms. Ice preserves, but it also kills. The balance has always been fragile. We have sought to maintain it, but the songs say that everything is cyclical. Another winter always comes, no matter how many times it is beaten back. You, Melisandre, have lived longer than most humans. You have walked many paths. Perhaps your place is not among men or gods, but among those who strive to restore balance." She looked up. "What can I do? I no longer trust the visions in the fire." "Then do not seek the fire. Seek the memory in the roots in the songs. We have shown you glimpses. If you wish to see more, you must leave behind your illusions. You cannot peer into the deeper truths while clinging to the glamours of a god you doubt." A tremor of fear passed through her. She set her staff aside and slowly reached to her neck. Her fingers brushed the ruby, which still held some warmth, though less than it once did. The gem was tied to her identity, to the youth and beauty she had wielded as a weapon, to the power she had drawn upon in R'hlloreth's name. The thought of removing it felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. But she knew this moment was inevitable if she truly wished to learn from the children of the forest. With trembling hands, she unclasped the choker. The ruby's glow dimmed as soon as it parted from her skin. Melisandre closed her eyes, expecting the wave of transformation. She felt her body grow colder, the warmth of the glamour receding. For a moment, she tasted ashes in her mouth. Then she opened her eyes and saw her reflection in the water of the stream. An old woman with hair like lifeless straw, face etched with deep lines, shoulders stooped under the weight of too many years. She gasped at the sight, tears springing unbidden to her eyes. Shame and sorrow flooded her. She expected the child to recoil, but the elder child only touched her bony shoulder with gentle compassion. "You remain who you are. The outer shell changes, but your spirit is the same. Now, perhaps you can see." Melisandre wept, silent tears that traced the furrows in her cheeks. She had not shed tears so freely in a lifetime. The children gathered around her in a circle, and under their guidance, she entered a trance-like state. She felt the rhythmic pulse of the weirwoods resonating through the stone walls. A soft humming chant rose from the children, ancient syllables that seemed to transcend language. In that haze of sound and presence, Melisandre felt her consciousness expand. She stood in darkness, though not a darkness of mere absence of light. It was a primordial void. Tiny flickers of color glimmered at the edges of her sight, shifting shapes that might have been memories or visions. She sensed vast silhouettes looming, one of fire and one of ice, locked in perpetual tension, neither able to fully overwhelm the other without unraveling the world itself. She saw faint shapes of men, dwarfed by the cosmic struggle, and among them, she recognized her own figure. Slender and robed in red, kneeling at the foot of a towering flame. Then the image shifted, and she saw an old crone in a weirwood grove. That crone was also her, lines of age marking her face like a living map. The crone lifted her gaze to the heart tree, and a swirl of leaves engulfed her. When she came back to herself, the chanting had ceased. She was lying on her side, cheek pressed to the damp ground, her body trembling with fatigue. The children watched her quietly. The elder child offered a small bowl of water, which she sipped. She felt the cool liquid soothe her dry throat. When she finally found her voice, it was ragged. I saw a struggle larger than men, larger than even the gods we worship. Fire and ice, locked in eternal dance. I saw that my old path was but one thread in a vast tapestry. But there was another thread, one I had never touched until now. The thread of the old gods, of the forest, of memory. The child inclined its head. These truths are ancient and perilous. We do not share them lightly, for men have so often turned them to destruction. Yet you come to us at a time when we cannot stand alone. She understood. The White Walkers were on the move, and men were divided. The children had few allies remaining, fewer still that would heed their counsel. If she could act as a bridge, a voice that spoke for the forest as well as for men, perhaps she could avert another cataclysm. If not, then the cycle would repeat, another war in which entire generations perished, and the forest would retreat further into legend and myth. Time wore on. Melisandre dwelled with the children, learning their songs, their wards, their illusions. These illusions were not drawn from a single divine flame, but from the resonance of life itself. She discovered that, stripped of her choker, she was still capable of magic, but it felt different. Instead of summoning flame, she found that she could coax illusions of leaves and shifting shadows to hide her presence. She learned how to scry not in fire but in still water, glimpsing faint echoes of possible futures. The children had no desire to create grand illusions or to enthrall armies. They merely wished to survive, to protect the living tapestry of the land. Yet Melisandre also remembered the threat from beyond the wall. She remembered that men were not wholly evil, even if they were dangerously short-sighted. Individuals like Jon Snow, Davos Seaworth, and others had hearts capable of compassion and honor. But men were too often mired in petty conflicts, dazzled by crowns and titles. She wondered if there was a way to unite them in time. Her old approach had been to champion one king, certain he was the prophesied hero. That had led to catastrophe. Perhaps her new role was to be a quiet guide, sowing unity where she could, bridging the gap between men's ignorance and the forest's knowledge. When she finally departed the cavern, it was with the elder child's blessing. She carried no staff of flame, and her choker remained carefully tucked away in a pouch. Her red robe had faded to a dull rust color, but she continued to wear it as a reminder of her past. Her hair, sparse and gray, lay loosely around her shoulders, and she wore a cloak lined with thick fur offered by the children. She looked every bit a crone stepping forth from legend. But beneath the frail exterior, a new resolve burned in her heart, a gentler flame of purpose that did not belong solely to Lawler. She emerged above ground in the dim twilight of a winter's day. Snow drifted between the pines. She half expected to see the gates of Castle Black in the distance, but the children's tunnels had led her to a part of the forest she did not recognize. The pines were taller, older, and the land was shaped into rolling hills. She used the skills the children taught her to orient herself. Feeling the bark of an ancient tree, she pressed her palm to it and breathed, letting her senses merge with the swirling energies beneath the soil. She gleaned some notion of direction. East lay the coast, west the lonely mountains, south the wall. North lay the heart of the other's domain. She began her journey south, deciding that her first step should be to find men who might still heed warnings of the others. She knew that the wildlings had more reason than most to fear the encroaching dead, but they also harbored resentment toward the Night's Watch and the kingdoms that lay beyond. She did not imagine the politics of men had become any easier in her absence. Still, she had to try. Her progress was slow. The winter wind gnawed at her bones, for without the constant warmth of her ruby, she was truly vulnerable to the cold. She relied on the small wards the children taught her, letting the forest itself shield her from the worst of the biting wind. Sometimes, she felt the presence of the children flitting through the trees, guiding her in subtle ways, ensuring she did not stumble into a White Walker patrol or a pack of whites. Now and then, she heard the distant howling of direwolves, and she could not help but think of Ghost, of Jon Snow, of all she had witnessed at Castle Black. She found the journey cleansing in a way. Each step reminded her that she walked as a mortal, frail and old, and yet still with a purpose. She no longer allowed illusions to shield her from the reality of the world's harshness. Each night, she found shelter in small hollows or beneath thick evergreen boughs, lighting a small fire only when necessary to preserve her life. But she never prayed to R'hllor. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened to the forest's lullaby, the rustle of needles, the creaking of branches, the distant call of an owl. Sometimes, she felt the old watchers of the wood guiding her dreams. She no longer had nightmares of flames roaring out of control, devouring innocence in the name of prophecy. When she grew close to the northern edge of the wall, she found it more difficult to hide her presence from men. Patrols of wildlings and Night's Watch Rangers prowled the area, wary of the undead that sometimes slipped around the edges of the great ice barrier. She decided at last that she must reveal herself. Men needed to hear a warning from someone who understood both sides of the magical divide. She knew they might not recognize her, for she was not the same regal red woman who once walked with kings. Late in the day, she approached a small group of wildlings camped near a cluster of rocks. They had built a fire, ringed by stones to shelter it from the wind. As she shuffled into sight, one of them leapt to his feet, spear at the ready. The others glared suspiciously, swords or axes in hand. Melisandre held her hands out, palms open, showing she was unarmed save for a small knife at her belt. "Who are you?" demanded one of the wildlings, a tall man with a braided beard and a scar over one eye. She took a breath, steeling herself to speak. "My name is Melisandre." She paused, expecting recognition, but none came. "I once served a king, and I once dealt in flames. But I come now with a warning from those who watch the woods." The wildlings glanced at each other. One woman snorted. "An old crone wandering around? Melisandre, you say? That name means nothing to me." It stung, but she realized it was perhaps a blessing that they did not remember her. "The others move even now. They gather strength in the far north. We must prepare, or all the living will be consumed by the dead." The tall man scowled. "We need no old crone to tell us that. We've seen the whites ourselves." "Then you know you cannot fight them alone. The Night's Watch, the kingdoms, the wildlings. We must stand together, or we will all fall." He spat on the ground. "Men of the southern kingdoms call us savages. They shut their gates. They don't care if we live or die. And the crows? They've done enough to earn our hatred." Melisandre nodded slowly. "I cannot argue with the wrongs done to you, but I also know that anger alone will not save your children. A new war brews, not a war of men, but a war of the living against the dead." He studied her for a long moment. Then, with a grunt, he gestured for her to sit near the fire. She sank onto a log, grateful for the warmth. The others remained wary, but they allowed her presence. She sensed that these wildlings had lost homes, loved ones, and illusions of safety. They had no illusions left, yet they had no love for the Southerners. She spoke quietly, telling them that hidden forces stirred in the heart of the forest, that the old gods themselves wept for the living. She told them that if men did not unify, they would be overrun. She omitted the details of her time with the children, for she suspected that was too much to reveal. Better to speak in half-truths than be branded a madwoman. After she had spoken, the wildlings regarded her with a mix of skepticism and fear, but they did not mock her outright. One woman said, "We already know the walkers come. Maybe if you're heading south, you can warn the lords yourself. Good luck with that. They'll hardly listen to us." Melisandre nodded, a tired smile on her lips. Then I shall do so if I can, and you do not lose hope entirely. I have seen alliances form when desperation is strong enough. They gave her some leftover stew and a ragged blanket. She dozed by their fire, feeling the ache in her old bones. She thought of how easily she could have conjured warmth in her youth, how her illusions had shielded her from the bite of cold. Now she felt it fully, and it was strangely comforting to know her vulnerability. She was no longer a zealot claiming divine invincibility. In the morning, they parted ways. The wildlings made for a hidden path through the mountains, while Melisandre continued south, aiming to find a way through the wall. She had no illusions of a warm welcome from the Night's Watch. She recalled how Jon Snow had exiled her and how Davos had wanted her dead. If they recognized her, they might cast her out or even execute her. Yet she felt compelled to try. The realm needed unity, and she needed to try every avenue to foster it. When she reached the wall, she glimpsed it rising like a monolith of ice, towering and majestic, even in her new perspective. She could see men patrolling along the battlements, black shapes against the pale blue of the frozen edifice. She realized she might not be recognized at all in her crone's form, but whether that was good fortune or an impediment, she did not know. She approached one of the narrow gates used by rangers, waving a strip of white cloth as a makeshift flag of peace. A handful of black brothers came out to meet her, crossbows held at the ready. She raised her arms to show she bore no weapon beyond the small belt knife. "Who goes there?" one called. "An old woman seeking refuge," she answered, her voice echoing in the still air. They stepped closer, peering at her haggard features. "What business have you here, old woman?" She swallowed hard. "I wish to speak with the Lord Commander, or whoever holds leadership here now. I bear warnings of the others." The men exchanged glances. "We've all got warnings of the others. You'll have to be more specific if you want anyone to listen." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Men call me Melisandre. I once resided here as counselor to the late Stannis Baratheon, who marched south." One of the watchmen snorted. "Melisandre? You look old enough to be her grandmother." The red woman was a beauty who glowed like hot coals. Well, you're definitely not her." She closed her eyes. "Nevertheless, I am who I say. I mean you no harm. If you'll not let me pass, I will go." She turned, making as if to leave, when another watchman called out, "Wait!" He drew closer, studying her face with narrowed eyes. "Something is familiar in your manner of speech. Perhaps we should let the higher-ups decide." In the end, they escorted her through the gate, keeping a watchful eye on her as they led her through the winding tunnels in the ice. She saw black banners stirring in the faint draft, felt the cold seeping through her thin cloak. Emerging onto the courtyard side of Castle Black, she saw the fortress was in a state of constant vigilance, men going about their duties with grim efficiency. Everywhere, the sense of tension weighed on the air. Winter had arrived fully, and the threat from beyond the wall had only grown. They placed her in a small chamber, not quite a cell, but guarded nonetheless. She did not complain. She was content to wait, perched on a wooden stool by a brazier that offered scant warmth. At least it gave her time to collect her thoughts, to plan her words. A lifetime ago, she might have manipulated flames to show illusions and awe her audience. Now she had only honesty, and whatever small measure of calm she had gleaned from the children's teachings. Eventually, the door opened. Davos Seaworth stepped in, followed by 2 guards. The Onion Knight's hair was grayer than she remembered, his face more deeply lined with sorrow and fatigue, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He took one look at the bent old woman in the corner and frowned. "You wanted to see the Lord Commander," he said. "He's occupied, so here I am instead. I'm an advisor of sorts. So who are you, really?" "The men say you claim to be Melisandre." She met his gaze and mustered a weary smile. "Ser Davos, I'm not surprised you don't recognize me. The illusions I wore are gone. The power of the ruby choker is gone. But I am Melisandre, nonetheless." His face hardened, the memory of old wounds flaring in his eyes. "Melisandre is a red-haired temptress who burned a child." She's the reason so many died for nothing. You're an old woman telling tall tales." She bowed her head. "I cannot atone for what happened to Shireen, or for how my counsel led Stannis astray. I do not deny my guilt." Davos clenched his fists. "Guilt doesn't bring her back." "I know," Melisandre said softly. "I have left the path of R'hllor, Davos. I found no truth in it, only illusions that cost the realm dearly." His eyes blazed with old fury, but he held himself in check. "Why come here then? You said you wanted to warn us about the others. We already know they're out there. We're mustering every ally we can find." She nodded. "You know of them, yes, but do you know they're growing bolder, their numbers swelling in the deeper north? The children of the forest watch them, see their movements. They are not idle. They gather. Time is short." Davos's lip curled in skepticism. "The children of the forest. So that's where you've been skulking? Another realm of magic." She met his gaze evenly. "Yes, they saved my life in a way. Taught me that the battle for the living is not merely about the triumph of flame over ice. It's about preserving the balance, the life of the land itself. R'hllor and the Great Other are locked in a struggle for dominion. But that is not the only story." Davos sighed heavily, running a hand across his grizzled beard. "I've no stomach for talk of gods and magic. All I know is that we must stop the army of the dead. Jon Snow, king in the north and warden of the realm by some accounts, has gone south to rally more support. He left me here to hold the wall if I can. What use are these forest creatures? Will they stand with us?" Melisandre hesitated. "Their numbers are few. They will not march like men. But they can guide us, show us ways to ward against the White Walkers. And if we fail to heed them, we lose a powerful ally. We must accept their help on their own terms." Davos studied her in silence for a long moment. Then he gestured to the guards. "Take her to a better room. Keep watch. I need to speak with the Lord Commander." He turned to her one last time. "If you are who you say, then you know I'd have gladly put a dagger in your heart before. But these are desperate times. If you can truly aid us, perhaps the realm has more use for you alive than dead. For now." She bowed her head in acceptance. "I expect no forgiveness, Davos. I can only offer what help I can." The guards escorted her to a small chamber, slightly warmer and furnished with a cot. She was given water and some bread. She leaned against the wooden wall, her mind churning with memories and regrets. She had once considered Davos a simpleton who understood nothing of the grand design. Now she realized he had always understood the human cost of her illusions, better than she ever had. In the ensuing days, she remained under watch. She was visited by Ed Tollett, who had become acting Lord Commander of the Night's Watch in Jon's absence. He regarded her with guarded curiosity, uncertain if this frail old woman truly was the Red Woman who had once haunted the halls of Castle Black. She offered advice on how best to communicate with the children, how to set wards around the forest edges to detect the movements of whites. She showed them small illusions, gentle illusions of rustling leaves or swirling dust, that she had learned from the children's methods, demonstrations of a different magic than the fiery conjurations she had once performed. Some of the men were unsettled, reminding each other of the shadow she had once birthed to slay Renly Baratheon, or the tales of how she had made fires dance in the night. But her illusions now lacked the ferocity of her old powers. She was no longer a herald of R'hllor's blazing wrath. She was something more fragile, more grounded in the slow pulses of nature, more mysterious in a quiet way. Word eventually came that Jon Snow and Sansa Stark were gathering forces in the north, forging uneasy truces with various houses. Davos left Castle Black for a time to meet with them, unsure if it was wise to leave Melisandre behind. But Ed promised to keep an eye on her. For her part, Melisandre did not attempt to flee. She had no illusions left. She would rather stay and see if she could help save the realm she had once endangered. As the weeks passed, the nights grew longer and colder. Reports filtered in of battles with undead creatures in the northern mountains, of sightings of White Walkers in the distance. Tormund Giantsbane, newly returned from arranging, stomped into the keep one night, caked in frost. He shot a suspicious glance at Melisandre, remembering her from days past, though her changed appearance confused him. When he learned who she was, he only snorted. "You were once the Red Woman," he said. "What are you now, an old oak?" She inclined her head. "I'm only a woman, Tormund, as mortal as any." He grumbled something about witches and illusions and left. But Melisandre could sense the fear lurking behind his gruff manner. He was a warrior who had seen too many horrors. His men had tasted defeat at the hands of the undead. She realized that, if anything, her presence was a grim reminder of how precarious their position truly was. One chilly morning, a horn sounded at the gates. Melisandre peered out to see a small party arriving. Jon Snow, Sansa Stark, Brienne of Tarth, and a handful of bannermen. They rode in with banners snapping in the wind. Word spread like wildfire. Jon had managed to secure enough support to attempt to stand against the White Walkers, but the war in the south still simmered. The Lannisters, the Targaryens, the Greyjoys, all had their own battles. The precarious alliances might crumble like a thin layer of ice on a frozen lake. Melisandre braced herself. She still recalled how Jon Snow had exiled her for what happened to Shireen. She did not expect him to show leniency if he recognized her. She stood near a brazier in the yard, cloaked in furs, her face mostly hidden. She watched Jon dismount, carrying the weight of leadership in his posture. He wore thick leathers and a battered cloak of black and gray. His eyes held the memory of death, and she realized how changed he was from the man she'd first met. He spoke with Ed, Tormund, and a few others before his gaze caught sight of her. His brow furrowed. He murmured something, and his steps carried him toward her in measured paces. She did not flinch but lowered her head in a gesture of submission. He stopped a few feet away. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. She raised her eyes, letting him see her weathered face. "An old woman who once led you astray. I do not expect you to believe me, but my name is Melisandre." He stiffened. She saw the flicker of anger in his dark eyes, tempered by uncertainty. "Melisandre burned a child at the stake," he said, voice cold. "She guided Stannis to his doom and nearly cost us everything. I told her never to return. Why should I not have you executed here and now?" She did not plead for her life. "Because I can help you." I cast aside the faith of R'hllor. I learned from the children of the forest who see more clearly than we. They know the threat that marches south. I offer you that knowledge freely. He glanced at the men around them. Some scowled, some looked uneasy. Sansa approached, eyeing Melisandre's face with clear suspicion. There was a tense silence. Finally, Jon asked, "What knowledge?" "That the war against the dead is not simply one of men's steel and dragonfire. The White Walkers wield an ancient power linked to the land itself. Your dragonglass and Valyrian steel can kill whites and walkers, yes, but the threat is deeper. They gather storms, twist cold into a weapon that breaks men's spirits. The children have wards that might hold them off, if men will only learn them." Jon's gaze flickered with a glimmer of interest. "Wards?" She nodded. "Not illusions like I once conjured, but spells woven into weirwoods, runes carved into stones, lines laid out across the land. We do not have the time or power to seal every pass, but perhaps we can slow their advance. The children can show us how, if we are willing to treat with them." Jon glanced at Tormund, who shrugged, and at Sansa, who remained impassive. He exhaled slowly, a cloud of steam in the cold air. "You come with quite the claim, old woman. If you are truly Melisandre, you have done much harm. But if your knowledge helps us survive, I won't cast it aside." She bowed her head. "That is all I ask." He turned to Sansa. "Have her watched closely. If she betrays us, she will pay the price." Sansa nodded curtly. Her eyes were like shards of ice, betraying no sympathy. Melisandre accepted it. She never expected forgiveness, only a chance to redeem her mistakes by helping defeat the greater enemy. That night, she was placed in a small chamber, guarded as before, while the leadership gathered in the common hall to feast and plan. She did not complain. She spent her time scribbling notes, trying to recall the runes the children had taught her. Her script was shaky, her hands trembled with age, but she persevered. Over the days that followed, she found herself consulted more often than she expected. They had heard rumors of Bran Stark, who held some strange power linked to the Weirwoods. She told them that if he truly was a Green Seer, his role would be crucial, though she did not claim to know the details of how. She explained that wards needed careful placement, that each must be carved into living wood or etched into stones in certain shapes. Men were skeptical but too desperate to dismiss any advantage outright. She accompanied small parties into the forest south of the wall, guiding them in the rituals to carve wards into ancient oaks or boulders near the roads. Although she could not replicate the full power of the children's enchantments, she taught them simpler runes that might slow the approach of the undead, or at least alert nearby sentries. Some men muttered that it was nonsense, but others noticed how animals seemed calmer within the warded areas, how the wind carried a subtler chill. A faint crackle in the air signaled that the old magic was at work. Jon Snow was forced to trust her knowledge, if only because they had so few alternatives. Yet, he remained guarded, and she did not blame him. She saw him walking with Davos sometimes, speaking quietly. She suspected her name passed their lips, heavy with distrust. She bore it quietly, focusing on her tasks. This was her penance, a vow of service to a realm she had once endangered. Word came that an army of White Walkers and Whites had been spotted by a scouting party, not more than a few days' march north of the wall. The tension in Castle Black mounted. Allies trickled in. Men from smaller northern houses, a few knights from the Vale, wildlings who had pledged to fight, and even some southern mercenaries hoping for coin. But the numbers were still dreadfully low compared to the legion of undead. On a frigid morning before dawn, Melisandre stood on the outer ramparts of Castle Black, gazing north as the sky began to lighten to a pale gray. She felt a stirring in the wind, a creeping dread that made her bones ache. She sensed that soon the living and the dead would collide in a horrific confrontation. She recalled her visions of a flaming sword in darkness, of a champion of light. Now she questioned all of it. Perhaps the champion was not a single man or woman. Perhaps it was the collective will of the living, united under a single purpose. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned to see Davos. He wore thick gloves and a fur-lined cloak, his breath misting in the air. He said nothing at first, merely stood beside her, gazing into the snowy distance. Finally, he spoke, voice gruff. "If we live through this, I don't know what'll become of you. I might still want your head, but right now, we need every advantage we can get." She inclined her head in understanding. "I deserve your anger, Davos. If helping you all survive is the only good I do in the remainder of my days, then let it be so." He studied her face, etched with age. "You really are her, aren't you? Without the ruby you look so different, but I can see it now. The eyes, maybe." She gave a tired nod. "Yes, I am." He looked away, the lines of bitterness still present, but less sharp. "Just do whatever it takes to keep these people alive." "I will." As the sun rose, horns sounded. Scouts returned, breathless, with news that the White Walkers were approaching a small village about 3 leagues north of the wall. The men of Castle Black scrambled to gather arms and form a raiding party. Jon Snow led them, with Tormund, Brienne, and several others at his side. Davos, never the greatest fighter, stayed behind to coordinate defenses, but he offered guidance and suggestions for strategy. Sansa stood on the ramparts as they left, worry creasing her features. Melisandre wanted to accompany them, to see if her new wards could be deployed in time, but Jon insisted she remain behind. She was not a warrior, and they could not spare soldiers to protect her. Instead, she gave him and Tormund advice on where to place runic markers near the approach to the village. They listened, albeit skeptically. Hours later, word came back that a skirmish had taken place, that the wards had, for a time, slowed the advance of the Whites, creating confusion in their ranks. Jon's party managed to evacuate some survivors before retreating. Still, the undead horde was on the march again, unstoppable in its relentlessness. But that small success, slowing the undead even marginally, breathed new life into the defenders. Perhaps these wards, these glimpses of the children's knowledge, could make a difference. In the days that followed, messengers were sent to gather more men, to erect wards along likely invasion paths. Melisandre worked tirelessly, instructing blacksmiths how to etch certain runes into metal. She taught men to carve symbols into doorposts and gates. It was a frantic race against time, and morale seesawed between desperate hope and crushing dread. During one dark afternoon, with snow swirling thickly, Melisandre walked the perimeter of Castle Black alone, chanting soft incantations she had learned in the forest. She pressed her wrinkled hands to the ice, feeling its ancient solidity. She tried to communicate with the hidden powers beneath the earth, with the memory of the weirwoods that lay scattered throughout the north. She was no green seer, and her bond was tenuous, but she poured her fragile will into the land, begging it to stand firm against the tide of death. Her voice trembled, tears gathering in her old eyes, for she felt every sorrow, every life lost because of her old convictions. She did not know if the land heard her, but she prayed in a way she had never prayed before, not to a single god of fire, but to the entire realm of living existence. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. One night, as she finished her chanting, she caught a glimpse of a small figure among the trees just outside the walls. At first, she thought it a trick of the blowing snow, but then she recognized the luminous golden eyes. A child of the forest stood there, watching, half hidden by a drift. Melisandre felt tears rise again, a mixture of relief and awe. She offered a silent greeting, and the child bowed its head. Then it vanished into the swirling whiteness. She took that as a sign of encouragement, that whatever else happened, the children had not abandoned her. Word of a final confrontation spread. The White Walkers were massing for a major push, possibly intent on breaching or bypassing the wall entirely. Jon Snow's forces and the garrison at Castle Black prepared, as best they could, for the onslaught. Dragonglass was distributed, and the wards were strengthened. Melisandre wandered among the men, offering quiet words, her presence ghost-like in the swirling flakes. Some eyed her warily, recalling her past. Others, especially younger recruits, saw only an old woman, perhaps a kindly crone who murmured odd chants. In the darkest hours before dawn, the assault began. A monstrous wind howled across the tundra, bringing with it an eerie glow, the reflection of moonlight in thousands of undead eyes. The White Walkers marched at the head, tall figures of frost and bone, brandishing ice-forged weapons that gleamed with malevolence. The Whites shambled behind, an endless tide of corpses. They converged upon the approaches to the wall, seeking a path of least resistance. Arrows rained down from the ramparts, torches flared, and horns blared. Men shouted in terror and determination. From the safety of the courtyard, Melisandre felt the cold presence creeping closer. She could sense the wards flickering along the lines of runes they had carved. She muttered incantations under her breath, feeding what little power she possessed into the invisible barrier. At first, the wards seemed to hold. The Whites slowed, milling uncertainly, as if some intangible force pressed against them. Some stumbled, collapsing as if the link animating them were disrupted. But the White Walkers were relentless. They raised their arms, channeling a frigid will that battered against the wards. Cracks appeared in the carved stones. Runes flared and sparked, and then began to wink out. Melisandre gasped as she felt the wards failing, one by one, like candles snuffed by a gale. The children had warned her that men lacked the deeper connections to fully power such enchantments, especially against such a concentrated force. She realized the White Walkers' unholy magic was older, perhaps equal in age to the wards themselves, forged in hatred and cold. This was not going to be enough. Still, the wards had done something. They had slowed the horde, given Castle Black precious minutes. The men on the ramparts loosed flaming arrows tipped with dragonglass, and the White Walkers withdrew from the immediate flames, letting their whites surge forward. The courtyard erupted in chaos as the front gates were tested. The Night's Watch and their allies braced pikes, brandishing obsidian weapons, hacking at any limb that crossed the threshold. Melisandre stood in the courtyard, heart pounding. She sensed the wards failing all around, the White Walker's power encroaching. In that moment, a primal instinct took over. Though she had turned from R'hllor, she still felt a small flicker of heat in her blood, an echo of the magic that had sustained her so long. She raised her arms, closed her eyes, and called upon the forest and the memory of living earth. She reached deep, imagining the labyrinth of roots she had sensed under the ground, the distant consciousness of ancient trees. She did not call for fire. She called for light itself, for life's warmth to push back the deathly chill. First, nothing happened. Then, slowly, she felt a stirring beneath her feet, a faint pulse of energy. She thought of the weirwoods, of the children's gentle guidance, of the subtle illusions they wove from shadows and leaves. She poured out all her remorse, her hope, her desire to protect the living. The ground shuddered faintly. A faint glow spread across the courtyard, not bright like flame, but pale and silver green, reminiscent of moonlight on leaves. The wights pressing at the gates faltered, some of them toppling as though their strings had been cut. Even the White Walkers on the far perimeter paused. Men gasped, unsure what they were seeing. The illusions that Melisandre conjured took shape. Faint specters of the forest, images of towering, ancient trees, ghostly animals bounding among them, appeared between the living and the dead. It was no physical barrier, but it carried the weight of a power older than men, a memory that refused to yield to the cold of oblivion. For a precious few minutes, it held back the tide of the undead. The watchers on the walls rallied, sending volleys of dragonglass arrows into the milling ranks of the wights. Melisandre's strength rapidly waned. She felt her knees buckle, her mind swimming in exhaustion. This was not a power she could wield for long. Yet, if it bought them moments to strike at the White Walkers, it might be enough. She heard Jon Snow's voice shouting orders, men charging forth in a desperate bid to shatter the White Walker vanguard. She glimpsed Tormund with his axe, slicing through wights left and right, and Brienne felling a White Walker with a well-timed blow of her Valyrian steel sword. The courtyard filled with the clamor of battle. At last, Melisandre could hold the illusion no longer. The ghostly forest faded, and she collapsed onto the snow, trembling violently. The cold rushed in, cutting into her bones. She felt arms lifting her, pulling her back from the front lines. She distantly heard men calling for a maester. Darkness tugged at her vision, and she welcomed it, certain she had done all she could. When she awoke, she lay in a bunk, covered with furs. Her entire body ached with a weariness she had never known, even in her centuries of life. A dim lantern flickered on a table nearby. She heard muffled voices outside, the footfalls of men on the move. She gingerly pushed herself upright, wincing at the pain in her joints. The door opened and Sansa Stark stepped in. She regarded Melisandre with a guarded expression, then set a pitcher of water on a table. "You're awake," Sansa said quietly. Melisandre swallowed, her throat dry. "What happened?" "We repelled the attack for now," Sansa replied. "The wards slowed them, and your illusions gave our archers time to cut down a lot of the wights. Some of the White Walkers retreated, though we lost good men and women." She paused. "Jon says you helped. Without that, the wall might have been breached." Melisandre felt a faint relief. "Good," she whispered. "Is it over?" "No," Sansa said with a tight shake of her head. "They'll be back. But we're stronger now, and more allies are on the way. Perhaps your wards will buy us enough time to unite the rest of the North." Melisandre nodded, taking a long moment to gather her thoughts. The pain in her body was intense. She reached for the pitcher of water, and Sansa moved to help her, pouring some into a cup. The old woman drank gratefully, feeling the chill ease slightly. She studied the young Stark woman, remembering the wide-eyed girl she had once seen, so full of fear and innocence. Now she was temper, ed by loss, her eyes steeled by suffering. Yet Sansa was alive, determined. There was a dignity to her that Melisandre admired. Sansa met her gaze. "Jon, he doesn't forgive you for what happened. Neither do I. But you've proven that you want to help, and we need every advantage we can get." She set the cup down, her voice brittle. "Maybe after this war is done, we'll see how you repay your debts." Melisandre nodded slowly. "I understand. I ask for no pardon, only that I be allowed to do what I can." Sansa studied her a moment longer, then turned toward the door. "Rest. The Maester says you nearly spent all your strength. We need you alive if your illusions can push back the dead." She left, and Melisandre lay back against the pillow, her mind drifting. She thought of the children, of the glimpses of golden eyes in the swirling snow. She had stepped away from Lawlor's faith, but in so doing, she had opened herself to a power that did not burn with a single god's ambition. Perhaps the illusions she conjured were not illusions at all but echoes of the forest's memory, ephemeral glimpses of a time before the others existed. She closed her eyes, letting sleep claim her. She did not know if they would survive the next assault, nor did she know if the realm would ever be at peace. But at least now, she walked a path of her own choosing, guided not by fear or blind faith, but by the hope of restoring balance. The children of the forest had shown her another way, and she would follow it until her last breath. If it helped prevent another long night, if it spared even one innocent life from the flames of fanaticism or the clutches of the undead, then her atonement would not be in vain. Days turned to weeks as the frigid siege continued. The White Walkers probed for weaknesses, shifting their attacks to other castles along the wall. Ravens flew south, bearing pleas for reinforcements. Small victories were won at a high cost. The war raged on, with the living clinging to the hope that their makeshift alliances would hold. Through it all, Melisandre remained at Castle Black, offering counsel and working with maesters and stewards to refine the wards. On rare occasions, she ventured beyond the gates under heavy guard to weave illusions that deterred small groups of whites, though each effort left her spent and frail. In time, word reached them that Daenerys Targaryen's dragons had joined the fight, unleashing fire upon the undead in the open fields far south of the wall. Yet, rumors also spoke of the Night King possessing a dread weapon of his own, leading an undead dragon in battle. The tapestry of war grew more complex. Melisandre wondered if, in the end, the realm's salvation would come from dragonfire or from the subtle wards of the old gods, or from something else entirely. Perhaps from the unity of men who finally realized they must stand together or die together. As the final confrontation loomed, Melisandre stood once more at the weirwood grove near Castle Black, her shaky hands caressing the carved face in the ghostly white bark. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer not to Lawlor, but to the old gods, to the memory of the land. She felt the silent watchfulness, the intangible presence that stretched across the root network. She breathed, letting the energy flow through her as best she could. The rustle of pine needles, the distant cry of a raven, the hush of falling snow, each sound reminded her that she was part of the living tapestry she once dismissed. In that moment, she felt the faintest echo of something else, like a gentle prod at her mind, a beckoning from far, far away. She understood it to be the children, urging her on, reminding her that the world they all shared was worth saving, no matter the cost. She whispered to the weirwood, "I was once a creature of flame and shadow. Now I stand with the forest. Let the living endure." And, for a heartbeat, she thought she felt the tree answer with a soft sigh, almost like the hush of a voice older than time. In that fragile peace, Melisandre felt at last that she had found some measure of redemption. She did not know if it would be enough to balance the scales of her past sins, but it was a beginning. Whatever the final outcome of the war against the dead, she had taken her place among those who fought for life, not for prophecy or dominion. If she died in the conflict to come, she would die free from the illusions she had once embraced. She would die aligned with the children of the forest and the silent, pulsing heart of the land itself. And that, at last, gave her solace.